Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to do something a little controversial. We're going to completely dismantle a universally accepted financial belief, and we're going to do it using an 18-year real-world mathematical test. I am so incredibly excited to share this with you today because we are really just going to tell a story. It's a story about a house, a ledger, and a massive cultural myth that pretty much all of us inherited without ever questioning it. Now look, people buy houses for beautifully human reasons, right? There's that nesting instinct, wanting to recreate your grandmother's garden, or honestly just a hunger for permanence in a really transient world. And those are wonderful, valid reasons, but today we're going to examine a completely different assumption. We're looking at the deeply ingrained idea that a house is arguably the single best financial investment an ordinary person can make. We are going to pressure test this with hard, objective numbers, tracking a truly fascinating narrative over nearly 2 decades. And I promise you, the ending is absolutely not what almost anyone expects.
Rent is throwing money away. You know this phrase, you've heard it, I've heard it. It is literally one of the most repeated sentences in our entire financial culture. It gets passed down from parents to children as gospel truth, it's echoed by well-meaning real estate agents, and it's repeated endlessly by finance influencers online. And you know, it really sounds like profound wisdom, doesn't it? It makes intuitive sense. But here's the thing. This quote is, at best, a very incomplete truth. Why? Because it entirely ignores its hidden twin, which is that mortgage interest is also throwing money away. Think about it. If you take out a standard 30-year mortgage at a typical rate, say roughly 6.6% on a $350,000 loan, your very first year of monthly payments might look like $2,400 out of pocket every single month. But over $1,900 of that goes straight to the bank in pure interest. That money isn't building your equity. It's not a savings account. It's essentially just rent that you are paying to a bank instead of a landlord. Except this rent comes with a massive 30-year legally binding contract and a lien on your largest asset.
So to truly understand how this math actually plays out in the real world, we need a story. I want you to meet our 2 families. We've got the Bradleys on one side and the Oay Whites on the other. Picture this. It is the spring of 2006, and they both move on to the exact same cul-de-sac in a nice, quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. The setup here is a perfect scientific control. It is completely identical. Both of these families are exactly 30 years old, both have 2 kids under the age of 5, both bring home roughly $95,000 a year in combined income, and crucially, absolutely fundamentally for our test, both families have managed to save exactly $40,000 in cash. But right here, at this exact moment in 2006, is where their paths completely diverge. The Bradleys take their hard-earned $40,000 and use it as a down payment on a beautiful $310,000 colonial home, taking out a 30-year mortgage at 6.4%. Pop the champagne, they are officially homeowners. Meanwhile, the Oay Whites look at that exact same housing market, they sit down at the kitchen table, do some napkin math, and they decide to rent a highly comparable house just 2 streets over for $1,650 a month. They then take their $40,000 nest egg and put the entire thing directly into a low-cost S&P 500 index fund.
Now, we are going to run the math on these 2 deeply consequential decisions through what we call the 18-year test. We're tracking them from 2006 all the way to 2024. Now, why 18 years? We are doing this because 18 years is not the kind of story anyone typically tells at dinner parties. It's a massive, grueling chunk of a human life. But 18 years is exactly the timeline required for the true, unvarnished financial ending to reveal itself. Think about what happened between 2006 and 2024. This timeline includes massive market booms, it includes the absolutely devastating 2008 global financial crisis, and it includes years of crazy inflation and wild interest rate fluctuations in the 2020s. It is literally the ultimate pressure test for the decisions the Bradleys and the Oay Whites made on that quiet Columbus cul-de-sac all those years ago. Let's see who actually won.
First up, Part 1, the hidden costs of ownership. Let's focus strictly on the Bradleys' path for a minute. Okay, so let's fast forward 18 years to 2024. Comparable homes on the Bradley Street are now selling for right around $520,000. I mean, on paper, they look like absolute financial geniuses. Their $310,000 asset magically became a $520,000 asset. That is a 68% appreciation. When you look at that, it feels like a massive, undeniable win, right? A truly spectacular piece of wealth creation. But here is the massive blind spot. A house is not a stock. A stock certificate doesn't ever need a new roof. Let's look at what actually physically left the Bradleys' bank accounts over these 2 decades. Look closely at this number, $210,000. This is the pure, unrecoverable mortgage interest the Bradleys paid to the bank on their 6.4% 30-year loan over those 18 years. This is arguably the single most underappreciated number in the entire homeownership conversation. You see, mortgage amortization is front-loaded by design. The bank makes absolutely sure it collects the overwhelming majority of its profit in the very first half of the loan. So before the Bradleys were even halfway through their 30-year term, they'd already sent hundreds of thousands of dollars out the door that did absolutely nothing to build their wealth. It was just the cost of renting the bank's money. Their entire massive paper gain from the house appreciating, it is basically completely neutralized by the interest they paid.
And honestly, the bleeding doesn't even stop at the bank. Here is another completely unglamorous number, $70,000. This is actually a highly conservative estimate for routine maintenance and necessary repairs over those 18 years. Real estate economists generally use what's called the 1% rule. You should budget 1 to 2% of your home's total value every single year just to keep the thing from actively falling apart. We are talking about the water heater that spectacularly dies in the middle of a freezing February, the roof that absolutely has to be replaced at year 15 because it's leaking, the wooden deck that rots out back, the driveway that cracks and heaves. Now, to be clear, this is not money spent on fancy cosmetic kitchen renovations or adding a beautiful sunroom. This is $70,000 of pure, mandatory survival maintenance spread over 18 years just to keep the house at its baseline value.
And when we look at the Bradleys' total 18-year bleed, it really shows how these hidden costs just relentlessly keep stacking up month after month, year after year. Let's break it down. Property taxes, roughly $65,000 to $75,000 paid straight to the local government. And remember, that is a bill that literally never ends, even after the house is completely paid off. Homeowners insurance, that's another $35,000 to $40,000. And we all know insurance premiums have been sharply rising lately due to climate-related risk repricing across the country. Then there's PMI, private mortgage insurance. Because the Bradleys didn't put down a full 20% up front, that's another $8,000 to $10,000 that just vanished into thin air. Finally, if they decide today, in 2024, to cash out and sell that $520,000 house, standard real estate commissions and closing costs will instantly vaporize another $25,000 to $30,000 before a single dollar ever reaches their bank account. So when you add all of this up, that massive paper wealth creation we talked about earlier, it gets eaten alive. In real, actual economic terms, the Bradleys are barely ahead of breaking even.
All right, so that's the homeowners. Let's move to part 2, the discipline of the renter, and look at the Oay Whites path.
Now, this is the counterfactual reality that almost nobody ever tracks, mostly because it requires an incredibly difficult level of behavioral discipline. The entire premise of renting being a mathematically viable strategy relies 100% on what you do with the money you aren't spending on a house. So step 1 for the Oay Whites, they took that initial $40,000 down payment, money they never spent on closing costs or a mortgage, and they kept it parked in a low-cost S&P 500 index fund. Step 2, they rented a highly comparable home, starting at $1,650 a month, which naturally crept up and rose with inflation over the 18 years. But here is step 3, and I really want to emphasize this because this is the absolute magic variable of the entire explainer. They consistently invested the monthly difference. You see, the Bradleys' total all-in housing costs, meaning their mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and that endless maintenance, were significantly higher than the Oay Whites' rent. That financial gap averaged about $700 to $900 every single month over the 18 years. The Oay Whites took that exact cash difference, and with unyielding, practically robotic discipline, they invested it into the stock market every single month for 18 years straight. They didn't spend it on lavish European vacations. They didn't use it to finance a nicer luxury car. They took the gap, and they invested it.
So let's take a look at the spectacular result of that strict discipline. Historically, the S&P 500 has run close to a 10% nominal return over long, multi-decade periods. That breaks down to roughly a 7% return after adjusting for inflation. And remember, we're talking about this specific 18-year period from 2006 to 2024. This time frame famously includes the absolutely brutal 2008 financial crisis, where the entire index plummeted by more than 50%. The Oay Whites had to hold on through pure terror as their portfolio was slashed in half. But because they didn't panic, because they held on and kept investing that monthly gap, the massive, snowballing power of compound interest took over. That initial $40,000 alone, without even counting a single one of those monthly $800 additions, would have organically grown to somewhere between $220,000 and $260,000 by 2024.
Okay, the moment of truth. Let's bring both of our families back together for the climax of the story. It is now 2024. The Bradleys, our proud homeowners, have a beautiful house worth $520,000. It is a fantastic home. They raise their kids there.
But we have to remember, that wealth is completely illiquid. It is trapped in drywall and timber. They can't exactly chop off a guest bedroom and hand it to a university to pay for their kids' college tuition, right? It requires a massive six-figure transaction cost to convert that house back into usable cash. Now, let's look at the Oay Whites, our highly disciplined renters. Factoring in their initial $40,000 seed money, plus relentlessly investing that monthly housing cost difference for 18 solid years, their stock portfolio lands plausibly between $480,000 and $560,000. They mathematically matched or quite possibly even beat the homeowners financially, and they did it without ever paying a single dollar of mortgage interest to a bank, no property taxes, no emergency roof repairs, and no real estate broker commissions. Furthermore, their wealth is entirely liquid. They can sell fragments of their portfolio on a Tuesday morning with a simple click of a button. They are absolutely not tied to the economic fortunes of one single localized zip code. The math here, when you actually do it honestly, completely shatters the myth.
So, part 3, Deconstructing the Cultural Script. Why do we believe what we believed? Think about this. If the math is actually this incredibly competitive, why does our society relentlessly, aggressively push homeownership as the only valid wealth-building strategy for normal, everyday people? What is actually happening in our collective psychology here? Well, the answer is a psychological phenomenon called survivorship bias. It's defined as the logical error of concentrating on the winners, the people who made it past some selection process, and entirely overlooking the losers. Think about your own family gatherings. You only ever hear those Thanksgiving dinner stories from the parents or grandparents who bought a house in, say, 1985 for peanuts, held it for 40 years in a booming coastal market, and now have $600,000 of pure equity. They are loud and they are extremely proud of their financial genius. But what about the family that bought at the absolute peak in 2007, immediately got underwater during the 2008 crisis, and had to literally walk away from the home or sell at a massive, devastating loss? I promise you, they do not volunteer that story over turkey and stuffing. The quiet failures systematically disappear from our cultural folklore. The stories we are constantly told aren't a perfectly representative sample of reality. They are just a highly curated sample of the outcomes people were happy enough to brag about.
But listen, we have to be completely fair here, because homeownership absolutely does have a superpower. It's just that the real advantage isn't mathematical, it is deeply behavioral. Look at the renter's brokerage account. It requires active, relentless, almost superhuman discipline over decades. You have to consciously choose to transfer that $800 gap every single month instead of upgrading to a bigger TV or taking a much-needed vacation or buying a nicer wardrobe. And honestly, most normal people simply do not have that level of financial discipline. Now look at the mortgage. Behavioral economics calls this a commitment device. A mortgage is a massive, terrifying bill that absolutely must be paid every single month, or the bank sends armed men to take your house away. It acts as a forced, non-negotiable savings mechanism for a population that structurally, fundamentally struggles to save money. For millions and millions of everyday people, buying a house is literally the only reason they end up with any significant wealth at all at age 65. Not because it was the best mathematical investment, but purely because it forced them to build equity when they otherwise definitely would have spent the cash.
And of course, there is also the reality of leverage, which in real estate is truly a massive double-edged sword. When you buy a home, you might only put down 20% in cash, but you get to keep 100% of the asset's appreciation. So if you put $70,000 down on a $350,000 house and the market goes crazy and the house goes up to $420,000, you have technically just doubled your equity. That is the win, and man, it is a powerful wealth builder. But the risk, and this is what people forget, is that leverage amplifies your losses exactly the same way. You are holding a fully exposed, highly illiquid asset that is heavily financed with debt. If the housing market suddenly drops by 20%, your entire down payment equity is wiped out instantly. You can't just sell off 10% of the guest bathroom to cover a margin call like you could by liquidating a few shares in a stock portfolio. You are completely stuck. The 2008 financial crisis stands as a permanent, terrifying monument to exactly what leveraged, undiversified real estate exposure can do to a normal household's net worth.
All right, part 4, the variables of choice. Let's talk about what actually fits your life.
The whole rent versus buy debate is never a simple, universal right or wrong. It is completely dependent on the specific, unique mechanics of your own life. There are basically 5 actual variables that determine the right answer for you. Number 1, time horizon. The transaction costs on buying and selling a home are absolutely brutal, usually eating up 8 to 10% of the property's total value. Because of this, financial planners universally agree that if you aren't staying in the home for at least 5 to 7 years, renting mathematically wins. Number 2, the gap between mortgage rates and market returns.
In eras of ultra-cheap debt, like the 3% mortgages we saw a few years ago, buying looks mathematically amazing. But when mortgage rates are high, like hovering in the mid-6 or 7% range, the math tilts incredibly hard toward renting and investing the difference. Number 3, your honest investing discipline. And I mean your actual track record, not your aspirational New Year's resolution discipline. Will you truly actually invest the monthly difference? Number 4, your local market trajectory. Buying a house means betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on one specific zip code, not the national average. What are the local jobs looking like? Housing supply, climate risks. And finally, number 5, what are you actually optimizing for? Are you optimizing strictly for maximum liquid net worth? Or are you optimizing for psychological stability and putting down roots?
And I think it's really important to contextualize all of this globally, because the intense emotional weight of the throwing money away myth is largely just a localized Anglo-American cultural artifact. In the US and the UK, there's this massive, heavy social stigma against renting long-term. People look at you like you haven't quite grown up yet. But look at Canada, right next door. They don't even have mortgage interest deductibility on their personal taxes, which completely changes the underlying math of ownership. And look over at Europe to countries like Germany and Switzerland. Homeownership rates there are significantly lower than in the US, and long-term stable renting is just considered the normal, responsible, default way to build a family and a life. The basic mathematical principles of compounding interest are universal, but the harsh social judgment we attach to renting, that is completely cultural. It is absolutely not a universal mathematical truth.
I want to be incredibly clear about something here. Buying a home is absolutely not a mistake. It offers total control over your own walls. It gives you the right to paint a bedroom whatever crazy color you want, the ability to let a dog run off leash in a fenced yard, the power to permanently lock your kids into a great school district. It provides deep, fundamentally human rootedness. But, as the source text we're analyzing brilliantly notes, buying a house is a consumption decision. It is in exactly the same category of financial decision as choosing to drive a much nicer car or choosing to eat at better, more expensive restaurants. There is absolutely nothing wrong with spending your money on things that genuinely make your daily life better. The problem, the trap we all fall into, is only when we culturally conflate a lifestyle consumption choice with a guaranteed risk-free wealth-building strategy and then act completely shocked when the final numbers don't match the folklore we were sold.
Which finally brings us to the ultimate conclusion of our 18-year journey with the Bradleys and the Oay Whites. The truth is, neither family made a mistake. They just made two completely different bets based on two totally different sets of personal values. But looking at the unvarnished math forces all of us to stop and ask this final, lasting question: are you buying an investment or are you buying a home? Because at the end of the day, the house was never really the investment. The house was the home. The investment, if there actually was one at all, was whatever happened to the money that nobody spent on the house. I really hope this explainer has given you a completely new, mathematically honest lens through which to view the roof over your head. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the myths.